There are seasons when it feels like God has turned his face away, when everything you built crumbles in your hands, when the prayers seem to echo back in silence and the very ground beneath you gives way. You try to hold on to your plans, to your strength, to the version of yourself that once worked, but it all begins to break. There comes a time when the soul meets a kind of breaking that no one can prepare it for. The kind that doesn't just shake what you have, it changes who you are. At first, you resist it. You try to hold together what's falling apart. You pray for the storm to pass, not realizing that sometimes the storm is the answer. Because God never breaks to destroy, he breaks to rebuild. What feels like loss is often love in disguise. When God begins to break a man, he is not angry with him, he is near to him. Scripture says, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. That closeness is not a gentle idea, it's an intimate reality. God steps nearer in your breaking than in your comfort. Because in comfort, you lean on yourself, but in breaking you lean on him. There's a story about a potter and his clay. The clay doesn't argue with the wheel, it simply yields. It allows itself to be pressed, reshaped, and sometimes even broken apart to begin again. We, too, are clay in the hands of a divine potter, and the breaking, though painful, is part of his craftsmanship. He sees the flaws we cannot, the hairline fractures that would not hold under the weight of future blessing. So he breaks not in punishment, but in mercy, reshaping us for something stronger, truer, more lasting. The man who has never been broken still believes strength is something he can build. But the man who has met his breaking learns that true strength is borrowed. It flows from God. That's why broken people often carry a gentleness that the proud never know. Their edges have been softened by grace. Their voices quieter, their eyes kinder, their hands more willing to lift others. Think of Jacob wrestling in the dark until his hip was touched and he walked with a limp. That limp was not a curse, it was a reminder. Every step hurt, but every step also testified, as I have seen God, and I will never walk the same again. His breaking became his blessing. Through his weakness, he found his true strength, not in the fight, but in the surrender. If you find yourself in a breaking season, don't mistake it for abandonment. You are not being punished, you are being prepared. What God is doing in you now is sacred work. He is hollowing out the places where pride once lived so that he can fill you with peace, compassion, and spiritual authority. Let the breaking do its holy work. Let it strip away what was never meant to stay, because the very fracture that feels like your ending is often the opening where his glory enters. And once you've been touched by that kind of love, you'll never see pain the same way again. It is the doorway, quiet, trembling, and holy, through which blessing begins to take shape. Before God can trust a man with destiny, he must first test him with surrender. It's not because God doubts us, but because he loves us too much to let our unbroken pride carry the weight of his blessing. The testing is not about proving our worth, it's about preparing our hearts to hold what's holy. And surrender is the proving ground of every calling. We often imagine that divine purpose arrives wrapped in clarity and comfort, but more often it comes through confusion, through the quiet ache of letting go. God will ask for the things we cling to most tightly, not because he wants to strip us bare, but because he wants to show us what cannot be taken from us himself. Look at Abraham. Before he became the father of nations, he was first the father of surrender. God asked him to leave his home, his land, his certainty. Later he asked for Isaac, the very promise that defined his future. And Abraham obeyed, not because he understood, but because he trusted. On that mountain, with the knife trembling in his hand, Abraham discovered that surrender was not the loss of promise. It was the revelation of God's heart. The same hands that tested him were the hands that provided. Every destiny begins there, in that holy tension between holding on and letting go. Because surrender teaches us to love God more than the gifts he gives. It refines our motives, softens our pride, and clears our hearts of everything that competes with his presence. Without surrender, the blessing would crush us. We would mistake calling for control and success for sovereignty. But through surrender, we learn the secret that all the greats of faith have learned, that God's strength is made perfect in yielded hearts. Think of Moses, stripped of his power in Pharaoh's courts and sent into the wilderness. 40 years of waiting, wondering if he had failed, when in truth, he was being formed. God was teaching him that leadership is not born from authority, but from obedience. Before he could part the Red Sea, Moses had to part with his own plans. The staff that once symbolized his livelihood became the instrument of miracles only after he laid it down. When God tests you with surrender, he is not taking something away, he is making space for something divine. He is teaching your soul how to breathe without needing control. It may feel like emptiness, but it is preparation, the sacred hollow where his blessing will soon dwell. So if you are in that place where God seems to be asking too much, know this: he is not trying to break your spirit. He is refining your trust. The weight of destiny rests safely only on surrendered shoulders. And when you finally lay everything down, you'll realize what he was giving you all along wasn't just the promise. It was himself, The blessing is hidden in the breaking. It sounds poetic, almost beautiful, until you're the one being broken, until the thing you prayed for falls apart, and the dream you thought was from God slips through your fingers. In those moments, the words don't sound poetic at all. They sound impossible. Because pain rarely looks like promise when you're standing in it. But that's the mystery of how God works. He often buries his blessings in the soil of our sorrow. When a seed falls to the ground, it must be broken before it can grow. If it stays whole, it stays alone, safe, unhurt, but fruitless. Only when the shell cracks open does life begin to emerge. Jesus said, "Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit." The same is true for us. What feels like dying is often the beginning of living differently, deeper, truer, freer. There are seasons when God answers your prayer by undoing your plan. You ask him to bless your life, and instead, he begins to dismantle it piece by piece. It's not cruelty, it's compassion. Because what you were holding so tightly might have been too small for the life he's calling you to live. He breaks the walls you built for safety because he sees they were also your prison. And though you may not see it yet, the breaking is the opening through which blessing enters. Think of Joseph. He dreamed of leadership, of greatness, of purpose. But before the dream was fulfilled, he was betrayed, thrown into a pit, and sold into slavery. Each breaking stripped something away, his comfort, his pride, his control. Yet in every breaking, God was shaping the man who could carry the blessing. The prison became the passageway to the palace. What others meant for evil, God turned for good. Sometimes the breaking feels unfair because it comes after faithfulness. You've obeyed, trusted, waited, and still the storm comes. But even then, the breaking is not a denial of your faith, it's the deepening of it. God is teaching you to see blessing differently, not as the absence of pain, but as the presence of his purpose in the midst of it. There will come a day when you'll look back and realize the blessing didn't come after the breaking, it was hidden within it. The breaking humbled you, it softened your heart, it stripped away what could not stay. And in that emptiness, God planted something eternal. So if your world is cracking open right now, don't rush to seal the wounds. Don't despise the pain that's birthing something new. The same hands that allowed the breaking are already shaping the blessing, and in time, you will see. They were never separate things at all, only two parts of the same sacred work. God does his deepest work in your lowest moments. That truth is both comforting and hard to believe when you're in the middle of it, when the night stretches long, when prayers return in silence, and when the things that once made you feel strong no longer hold. But the valleys we dread are often the classrooms of heaven. It is there, when everything else fades, that God begins to reveal himself in ways the mountaintop never could. We spend so much of our lives trying to avoid the wilderness, as if its barrenness means God has left us. Yet, if you listen closely, the wilderness has its own kind of holy sound. It is quiet, but not empty. It is lonely, but not godless. The desert is where God strips away the noise so he can speak in a whisper. When life becomes still enough, the soul begins to hear what business once drowned out. Think of Elijah running from fear and exhaustion, hiding in a cave. The prophet who once called down fire from heaven now trembled, convinced his purpose was over. But in that cave, God revealed something new, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still, small voice. That's how God works in our low places. Not always in power, but in presence. Not in grand displays, but in gentle revelation. Sometimes your lowest place is not punishment, it's preparation for intimacy. When life breaks you down, it also breaks open the parts of you that have been too closed, too defended, too proud. In those tender cracks, the light of grace begins to enter. God does not waste pain, he transforms it into a doorway to his heart. He meets you there, not to lecture, but to love you back to life. David knew this well. Before he wore the crown, he wore the wilderness. Long before the throne, he had caves and tears and sleepless nights. Yet it was in those hidden, lonely places that he learned the sound of God's heartbeat. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Notice he doesn't say as after the valley, but through it. Because God's presence is not found on the other side of the pain. It's found inside it. If you are in your lowest place now, don't mistake it for God's absence. The silence is not abandonment, it's an invitation. The dark may be the very ground where something sacred is being formed. You may not see it yet, but heaven is near, closer than your own breath. Stay there long enough to listen, because it's in the valley that his voice grows tender and his love becomes more real than ever before. And when you rise again, you'll carry that stillness with you into everything that comes next. Sometimes, before God can trust us with the fullness of his blessing, he must first teach us how to live with empty hands. That lesson rarely feels like love at first. It often feels like loss. The things you thought would last begin to crumble. The doors you prayed would open remain shut. The people you leaned on seem to drift away, and you're left holding nothing but the ache of what once was. Yet this emptiness is not the end. It's the beginning of becoming who you were meant to be. There's a quiet mystery in how God works with human hearts. He takes away not to leave us barren, but to prepare room for something greater. A clenched hand cannot receive. And so sometimes life must unmake us so that grace can truly fill us. The breaking you feel is not destruction. It's a divine rearranging. It is the moment when God begins to rebuild you on foundations that cannot be shaken. Job understood this. Everything he owned was stripped away, his wealth, his health, his family, even the comfort of his friends. Yet through the ashes, Job discovered a truth that only the broken can fully know. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That kind of trust is not born in comfort. It is forged in fire. When you have nothing left to cling to but God, you begin to find out that he was enough all along. We think blessings come only in the form of abundance, but sometimes the holiest blessings come wrapped in absence. What God removes, he often replaces with himself. What he takes from your hand, he fills in your heart. You begin to trade control for communion, striving for surrender, fear for faith. You begin to understand that the true treasure was never what you possessed. It was who was walking with you through the loss. Maybe this is what it means to live blessed, to be stripped of illusions so you can see clearly again, to lose your own strength so you can rely fully on his. The greatest blessings are not things you can measure. They are the peace that survives the storm, the faith that grows in darkness, the love that refuses to let go even when everything hurts. There's a kind of holiness in emptiness when it's surrendered to God. It becomes sacred ground, an altar where the old you quietly dies and the new you begins to breathe. In time, you'll see that what was taken was never meant to harm you, but to heal you. The breaking was mercy in disguise, because only an emptied vessel can be filled to overflowing. And when the blessing finally comes, and it will, you'll know it didn't come to you, but through you. You will have become the blessing, because God himself will have taken residence in the space where everything else once was. And from that still, surrendered place, the next chapter begins to unfold. There is a moment in every breaking when something sacred begins to shift, a quiet, unseen exchange between pain and purpose. It's not always dramatic. Often, it comes softly like dawn creeping into a dark room. It's the moment when what once felt like ruin begins to reveal the outline of redemption. When the very thing that crushed you becomes the soil from which something eternal starts to grow. You see, God never breaks a man to destroy him. He breaks him to rebuild him into something truer, freer, and more deeply rooted in love. Every fracture in your heart, every tear that fell unseen was not wasted. Each one was a seed, and seeds must first be buried before they bloom. The darkness you've walked through wasn't your grave, it was your planting ground. Think of Joseph, betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit and left forgotten in a prison. For years he must have wondered why God had allowed such injustice. But God was writing a story beneath the surface, a story Joseph couldn't yet see. The pit was not punishment, it was preparation. When the time was right, the very hands that once sold him into slavery would bow before him in reverence. The breaking was the making. It is a strange mercy, this divine breaking. For it is in that space where we stop trying to prove, perform, or control. The proud heart softens. The fearful soul begins to trust again. In the stillness of surrender, we finally allow God to be God. He takes our wounds, our disappointments, our shattered dreams, and turns them into places where his light can shine through. What once felt like failure becomes testimony. What once felt like loss becomes legacy. There is a sweetness that only the broken know, a gentleness of spirit, a depth of compassion, a wisdom that cannot be taught in ease. You begin to see others differently, not through judgment, but through mercy. You recognize the ache in their eyes because you've known it yourself, and that recognition is holy. It's where love becomes real, not just in word, but in presence. Sometimes God must allow your strength to fail so that his grace can rise. The man who once relied on his own might learns to move in quiet dependence. The woman who once fought to be understood begins to rest in being known by God alone. This is the hidden beauty of being broken. You no longer live from the surface, you live from the soul. And from that soul, healed by grace and refined by fire, something eternal begins to breathe. You carry the fragrance of heaven in your humility, the reflection of God in your scars. The breaking becomes your anointing. The pain that once silenced you becomes the voice of truth that lifts others from their darkness. And as the pieces of your old self fall away, you begin to see it clearly. The breaking was never the end. It was the sacred beginning of becoming whole. There comes a moment, after all the breaking and waiting, when you begin to see the gentle fingerprints of God over everything that once hurt you. You look back, not with bitterness, but with quiet awe, because somehow, in the midst of all that loss, love was still at work. Somehow, even when you thought you were falling apart, you were being reshaped for something far greater than you could have imagined. This is how God blesses. not always with riches or recognition or the things the world calls success. He blesses by giving you eyes that see differently, a heart that feels deeply, and a faith that stands even when everything else falls. He blesses by turning your pain into compassion, your waiting into wisdom, and your scars into sacred stories that can heal others. When God breaks a man, it is only to remove what cannot go with him into the next season of grace. Pride, fear, control, old identities, they fall away like autumn leaves, making room for the new growth of spring. And when that man rises again, he rises gentler, humbler, stronger, not because he fought for himself, but because he finally let God fight for him. If you are in that breaking season now, take heart. You are not being punished, you are being prepared. You are not losing, you are learning how to hold what truly lasts. What feels like the end is only the middle of a holy process. The potter is still at the wheel, shaping you with hands that know exactly what you're meant to become. So stay open, stay faithful. Let the breaking do its sacred work. For one day, when you stand in the light of all that God has done, you will understand why the blessing had to come this way. And in that understanding, peace will find you, not as a fleeting feeling, but as a home your soul finally rests in. Because every breaking that comes from God leads not to ruin, but to resurrection. And when he blesses what he has broken, nothing in heaven or on earth can take that blessing away.